In this video, we are going to cover the thorax, the vertebral column, as well as the hyoid bone. So we'll start off with the hyoid bone, and it's basically this very small U-shaped bone. Now what's very unique about this bone is that it does not articulate with a single other bone in the body. So it's, in a sense, free-floating. And what it does is provides a site for muscle attachment for many different muscles involved in speaking and swallowing. So that's all you need to know about your hyoid bone. It's a part of your axial skeleton. Now where it sits on the skeleton is just above your larynx, which is slightly below your mandible. So you would almost not be able to see it, but it would be right under here, underneath your mandible. So that's your hyoid bone. Now we're going to cover the vertebrae. So there are a couple structures of the vertebrae I want you to know. So if we look at the individual vertebrae, which just for now, this is a lumbar vertebrae. So we're just going to use this as an example to show you the different structures on every single vertebrae in the body. So here we have the body of the vertebrae. So this is what you would see anteriorly, like on this guy. You could see the body of the vertebrae from the anterior. So here you have the body. If you look on either side, we have little processes known as the transverse processes. So the two that are on the lateral surfaces, those are known as your transverse processes. Then we have one that sticks out posteriorly. So if this side's anterior, this side is posterior. And this process is known as your spinous process. Another structure to know is the large hole here. So this hole there, that is known as your vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen, once you start stacking up the vertebrae on top of each other, that's actually going to create your vertebral cavity through which the spinal cord will run. Surrounding the vertebral foramen, we have what's called the neural arch. So this little arch here, that's called the neural arch, and this here is the vertebral foramen. So knowing that, we can use those individual structures of the vertebrae to determine which type of vertebrae we're talking about. So we have 32 to 34 total vertebrae. It really just depends on the individual. But generally speaking, we definitely have 7 cervical vertebrae. The differences basically lie in the sacral and the coccyx region. So here we can see our 7 cervical vertebrae. And if you remember, the structure on the occipital bone, that is called the occipital condyle, and it's going to articulate with the first cervical vertebrae. So that's called your C1. Now I'm going to show you what the C1 looks like, because it has a very particular appearance to it. Now any cervical vertebrae that we talk about, they will all have what's called transverse foramen. So here's your transverse processes on either side, and then only in the cervical region will you see foramen on the transverse processes, and those are called your transverse foramen. Now here again, this is going to be your vertebral foramen, and that's going to be where the spinal cord will pass through. But you'll notice for the C1, and only the C1, that two things are missing. The body, so if we take a look at C7, we see that C7 has a body. So C1 is the only vertebrae that does not have a body. But you can also see on C7, here we have once again our transverse foramen. So you know it's a cervical vertebrae. So back to C1, it has no body, and it also has no spinous process. So you will not see a spinous process on C1. So normally a spinous process would extend posteriorly, but you don't see that here. So there's no body, there's no spinous process, but you do have two transverse foramen and a very large vertebral foramen. So that's your C1, also known as your atlas. So your atlas superiorly will articulate with your occipital condyles to create the atlanto-occipital joint, or your AO joint. Your AO joint is what allows you to nod your head up and down. So we call it the yes-yes joint. So this is C1, and here we have C2, which again is a very distinguishable vertebrae. The reason being is that on the body there's a process known as the dens. And embryologically, this dens actually comes from the body of C1. So here's your C2, you know you're in the cervical region because you can see the transverse foramen here. So there you have your transverse foramen. And then you know we're talking about C2 specifically because you can see the dens sticking up from the body of C2 superiorly, and basically C1 will sit on C2 like this. And it creates a pivot joint. So this joint is called your atlanto-axial joint because C2 is also known as the axis, C1 is your atlas. So it's creating your AA joint, and we always say no, no to AA, right? So this basically allows the twisting motion here of your head. So it allows the lateral rotation of your head. So that's why we call the AA joint the no-no joint. So looking at C7, we know that we have our transverse foramen here, so we're still in the cervical region. But now we see our body and a bit of a longer process here. So the C7 is actually known as your vertebral prominence because that's the one, if you feel in the back of your neck, you feel a very large notch, and that's the spinous process of C7. So that covers our cervical region, so from here to here. Now, something that I didn't mention is through the transverse foramen, that's actually where the vertebral artery will be traveling. So your vertebral artery is a single artery throughout the rest of the vertebrae, but then once you get up to your neck, it splits into two and goes up both sides of the neck. So the transverse foramen basically allow the vertebral artery to run through it. Then it comes up and it'll enter along with the spinal cord into the foramen magnum. Okay, so on to our thoracic vertebrae. So our thoracic vertebrae, there are 12 of them, and each of them will be articulating with a rib. So you can see here's your rib cage. We have 12 ribs. Therefore, we have 12 vertebral or thoracic vertebrae. So each of these thoracic vertebrae are articulating with a rib, and you'll notice also the spinous processes of the thoracic vertebrae are a lot longer, and they tend to slant down at an angle. This is because your thoracic vertebrae are going to restrict movement. So if you try to flex back, or if you try to flex or extend your back, then these vertebrae will lock on each other. And they do that to basically prevent hyperextension and hyperflexion of the back. And this is a way to not only protect the internal organs that are caged in here, but also to protect the spinal cord. So we have the 12 thoracic vertebrae, and you know that T1, so if you see here, these are your first pair of ribs here. So you know that T1 is going to be the vertebrae that's articulating with the first pair of ribs. Same down here, if you see your 12th rib here, you know that T12 will be the one that's articulating with the very last rib. And that way you can say this is T12, the one below it is going to be your L1. So that'll be your first lumbar. Now while we are up in the thoracic region, I figured I'd go over the ribs with you. So the ribs, they articulate with the vertebra in the back and they wrap around the front. And we learned that the sternocostal joint, so sterno means sternum, costal means ribs, is actually held together by the hyaline cartilage. So the hyaline cartilage here, we call it costal cartilage. And basically ribs number 1 through 7, so 1 through 7 here, those ribs are known as your true ribs. This is because their costal cartilages directly articulate to the sternum. Ribs number 8 through 10, so the bottom 3 of the rib cage, those 3 are called false ribs. This is because the costal cartilages of ribs 8 through 10 actually come up, fuse to the costal cartilage of rib number 7, and then connect to the sternum. So it's an indirect connection to the sternum. So that's ribs number 8 through 10. And then our last 2 ribs, 11 and 12, those are called floating ribs because they have no attachment to the sternum. Now the sternum has 3 parts to it here. So here is another view of the sternum. The superior portion of the sternum is called the manubrium. So the manubrium basically has 2 little notches up here for the attachment of our clavicle bones, and it also provides the articulation for the first pair of ribs. So the manubrium articulates with the clavicle bones and the first pair of ribs. The body, which is from my top finger to my bottom finger here, that body is going to articulate with ribs 2 through 10, whether it's directly or indirectly. And then we have a little process down at the bottom that's called your xiphoid process. And just like any other process, it's providing a muscle attachment point specifically to your rectus abdominis, which is also known as your six-pack. So that's going to be your sternum, the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. So then we move on to our lumbar vertebrae. And you can see that the lumbar vertebrae, there are 5 of them. So there's L1 through L5. And you can see that right here is where you find that curvature in your back. So those are going to be your lumbar, the lower back. You'll notice that the spinous processes of the lumbar are much shorter and broader than the thoracic. And you'll also notice that the bodies of the lumbar are much larger. So the bodies are larger because they provide, the lumbar region has more weight to bear than the rest of them. So therefore the body's larger and provides more support to the lumbar region. The spinous processes are a little bit shorter and broad, and those actually will allow for some movement of your back. So you can laterally rotate and laterally flex your back with your lumbar vertebrae. But most of the movement that we consider back movements actually comes from your hip joint. So then we have our last two vertebral regions. So we have our sacrum, which is, there's a single sacrum in an adult. So we have our sacrum here, and the sacrum is basically where 5 vertebrae have fused together. Then at the very bottom we have our tailbone, also known as the coccyx. So our coccyx bone was actually 4 vertebrae that have fused together. Another view of the sacrum and the coccyx would be this, so a little smaller view. And so here you have your sacrum, which will attach to your hip joints or your pelvic girdle, and then you have your coccyx, your tailbone, down here. So that concludes the axial skeleton.